I'm Professor Sybil White from the English department, and it's good to have you here. You're all taking part in the welcome read. Today we have a speaker who is going to be talking to us and introducing us to the time that the book, March Book 3, that you'll be reading in your classes took place. Dr. Zebulon Miletsky is an associate professor of Africana Studies at Stony Brook University. Dr. Miletsky is a historian specializing in recent African American history, civil rights and Black power, urban history, mixed race and biracial identity, and hip-hop studies. His book, Before Busing, A History of Boston's Long Black Freedom Struggle, was published by North Carolina Press in 2022. He is also at work on his second monograph, A History of Interracial Marriage and Racial Passing in Boston and Massachusetts. Dr. Miletsky earned a PhD in African American Studies with a concentration in history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in 2008. And he also, just to add this, he also met John Lewis, and he will tell us about his meeting with John Lewis, who is the author of the book, March Book 3, and who the book is about his times as a student activist. And it is a pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Zebulon Miletsky.
Wow, thank you. That's quite an introduction. I'm very happy to be with all of you today. Good morning. Thank you for coming. I wanted to at least be sure that I was here on time. I think I met some of you already in the hallways trying to find my way to the class, to the buildings. This is a real interesting campus, really nice campus. I guess I'll jump right in. My understanding is that you all have had or are about to have a marvelous opportunity to read a pretty amazing book that I have actually, in hearing about the project, actually picked up myself. I grabbed a copy of it, and it's very, very powerful. It's very, very vivid, very interesting, and it's actually, as you probably already know, the book itself is done in a graphic novel format, meaning, like comic books. This is a good way to learn history, I believe. This is a very good way to learn it because it's very interesting. It brings it alive. And it has the power that comic books have. It's comic book world now. You think about, the movies, Black Panther, Wakanda, and so on, Afrofuturism. It's right in sync with that. But I want to say also thank you to the English department. Let's give them a quick round of applause to say thanks. I don't know if people spend a lot of time around here clapping for the English department or the or other departments, but you should. We should definitely, because they do a lot. They work hard, and probably you know your teachers and professors better than I'm just meeting them. And also, probably should thank the college itself and just the humanities department, because I'm sure there's a lot of people here from the humanities. So I'm going to jump right in and share my screen for those on Zoom. And my understanding is there's also a Zoom component and a Zoom audience. So I'm not sure. There's like 3 cameras here. You guys do it up with technology. I think it's this one here, and then they say use a point in the back of the room. But thank you all for joining us and being here this morning to talk about the 1960s. The 1960s. This is this is meant to be an intensive kind of work session today, real quick one when you think about it, and one that's, I think, meant to just be kind of a quick primer to lay down some of the facts, to talk about some of the different, things that took place that you'll see dramatized. No spoiler alerts. I don't want to say too much about the graphic novel because I want to leave some for you, but just to share with you the opening pages of it, because, I won't say what's in the last pages of it, but in the opening pages, it opens with the morning of 4 little girls who were getting ready to go to church school and then to church services in Birmingham, Alabama. And it was on September 15th, which just passed a couple of days ago, a few days ago, 3 days ago. On that date, white supremacists in Birmingham, Alabama, basically set off a bomb in the church that killed those 4 little girls. Yesterday was Sunday. Some of us weren't. Some people might have been in church. I don't know. Some people maybe you go on holidays, or maybe you just go with the family occasionally when you can, or maybe you go a lot. I'm seeing a lot of good energy in here. People probably imagine in your church, and all of a sudden, boom, explosions, fire. We have actually a long history of dealing with terrorism in the case of church bombings. But anyway, I only mention that because that's the opening pages of this book, The March. I was hooked right there, the power of that. But what was the context of it? What was going on? Okay, let's start right here. It was mentioned that I had a chance to meet the man, the legend, this living embodiment of what the Black freedom struggle was about and is about, Congressman John Lewis. And I wanted to just share a quote with you that I was looking up, that I've heard and used a few times. John Lewis said, "Never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. Get in good trouble." Good trouble to John Lewis was the stuff of his life. It was the place where he learned to become a leader. It was how he became prepared to lead a movement. And he did it as a student member of an organization that I'm going to be talking about a lot, called SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But John Lewis was definitely himself, speaking of, was a special individual with special talents. And he was a man of God. He followed and worked with Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But this photograph was taken at the SNCC 50th anniversary. I want to make sure that's right. 50th anniversary at Shaw University. That was in 2010. Would have been 2010. Had a chance to have my photograph taken with John Lewis. And he's just somebody that I think I've always admired because he had courage. He stood up, and he was a very brave individual, but we'll come back to that. What is the stuff that the movement that John Lewis and other people like John Lewis, what were they pushing back against? What is this thing known as Jim Crow? That's a title that you're going to see. Words like that are things you're going to see in this comic book. But my job is to come and tell you something that's not in the comic book. There's something before the comic book, right? To help to supplement your understanding of this important graphic novel. So they're using terms like Jim Crow. Where does that come from? That actually came from this tradition of blackface, as some people may call it, or minstrel era. In 1832, Thomas D. Rice wrote a song titled Jim Crow, which is where the term originated. And this is the sheet music for it. Now, this comes from that, tradition that some of us might see in books or in movies and film, but is part of the real, sort of past of America. This was, now, even though in the sheet music, it looks like somebody who might be black, Thomas D. Rice was not black. He was a white man not from South Carolina, not from Mississippi, not from the South. Does anybody want to guess? He was from New York, here in the North. So a Northern person who came up with this dance called the Jim Crow dance and the Jim Crow song, I wheel about and jump just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. That's where it came from. And so anyway, this was a very popular form of music in the 19th century. Comes from New York, same traditions of Tin Pan Alley and those kinds of things. Not from the South, but from New York. But anyway, that is where the term comes from. So graphics, art, can inform life in many cases. And here's one of those examples. Speaking of examples, segregated facilities. These are examples of segregated facilities. The real manifestation of that same mentality. The colored waiting room, you see. Different drinking fountains. Look at the differences between what will be labeled as a colored drinking fountain versus a white drinking fountain. This one is probably colder, I have to imagine. And so on and so forth. To understand the 1960s, got to go back to the 1950s. A big case that was decided, Brown versus Board of Education, May 17th, 1954, is the break in this whole process that is going to make the civil rights movement that John Lewis was a part of possible. And it stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Separating children solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority as to their status in the community that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely to be undone. And basically all that means is that the act of separating people, of segregation itself, right? Because some people might say, well, what was the big deal about segregation? It does something to the mind and to the heart that's unlikely to be undone. In this legal victory opens the door to the ending of this thing called Jim Crow. And you can see here, the undertakers are carrying the cast out. Here lies Jim Crow. So what were the events happening in the 1960s that made this possible? The first one that you need to know about is the first sit-in, February 1st, 1960, that took place at the Woolworths counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, this is important because the civil rights movement had been happening in the 1950s, and in fact, there's a misnomer there, because when we say the civil rights movement, we always think, 1960s. But if you actually think about it, everything that was important, the Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, Little Rock, Arkansas, and the desegregation of schooling, were all in the 1950s. So what's different about the 1960s is that students get involved. The students get involved into the movement. And this was their idea. They said, what can we do that would be different from what's already been done, right? What they did was they sat in at these lunch counters, and they remained seated until they were served or arrested. Now, this caught on like wildfire. A lot of other students took on this same plan. And it happened in many cities all across the South, and eventually even in the North. So the point is, these people were no older than yourselves, right? Your age is what the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, people your age, never doubt that anybody, even of your age in college, can make a difference. The protests soon spread throughout North Carolina and eventually to 26 southern cities. How many of you could sit still for something like this, if you really think about it? Especially in today's climate. I have Instagram. I've seen, the fighting, the different, people, we are very quick to go to our hands in this day and age. Not everybody, but a lot of times. And especially in the communities from many of which that we all grew up in or come from, right? Somebody pouring mustard on your head or ketchup, it took tremendous discipline. And that was a discipline that's drawn from the Black church traditions. A lot of the trainings for nonviolence took places in the basements or in the sanctuaries of churches. And it had that part of it from a Judeo-Christian perspective. That's very important to understand people like John Lewis and just ordinary folks who stood in the gap, but had tremendous discipline and training to be able to do that. Sit-ins were also successful defeating segregation in public parks, swimming pools, theaters, churches. Speaking of churches, also other problem. Libraries, museums, and even beaches. So even in public parks or recreational places. A lot of this was done, I think, and again, that psychological part. If a Black person even, dared to jump into a swimming pool, you could be sure that the next day they were going to drain that swimming pool and be out there cleaning that swimming pool in a way that the public could see it, because it has that psychological aspect to it. Most of the protesters were students who were impatient with the slow progress, and they formed at the suggestion of Ella Baker, who informed the students and said, don't just become, mini Martin Luther Kings. Don't just become a little SCLC, as they called it, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Because Southern Christian Leadership Conference was basically all made up of pastors. They were almost all religious men, pastors, because in the case we're talking of the Black church, like Martin Luther King and others. And they said, no, start your own organization that will be independent of that. And so they started something called Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they were well counseled by Ella Baker, and they followed suit. The reason that photo I took was in 2010 in Shaw University in North Carolina was because that's where SNCC was started in 1960. They believed that if Northern white America was shown on television nonviolent responses to police brutality, the movement would gain momentum. Eventually, the authorities caught on, and brutality was only practiced behind closed doors. So we're talking about violence. We're talking about brutality that's being used. And these were some of the goals. This is going to be recorded, so I know you'll be able to come back and see this information if you need it. But it was formed in 1960, as I said. Main goal was to give Black people political efficacy by registering voters, by exercising the franchise. Now, I want you to know that John Lewis became and would become its first president of SNCC. He was the first president of it. Now, as things moved forward, things began to change and shift, and a move toward the period we call Black Power took over, and in 1966, Stokely Carmichael took over. But I'm going to come back to that, but he embraced the term Black Power. He actually threw all the white people out of the organization and began working with the Black Panthers. But that brings up another important point. SNCC was an interracial organization. I want to be real clear about that, because sometimes we make assumptions, don't we? We'll assume, oh, okay, this has to be an all-black organization because this is an organization for black people, right? No, not actually. SNCC was interracial from day one. In fact, their logo was a white hand and a black hand clasped together. But by 1966, things had changed so much that it does become, and that's probably why sometimes we think of SNCC as a militant organization, because it has both of those legacies. It has both of those legacies. In October of 1960, Martin Luther King was arrested during a sit-in in Atlanta. Because of the major media coverage, both presidential candidates, remember in 1960, there's a presidential race happening, were pressured to take a stand. John F. Kennedy called Martin Luther King's wife and helped arrange his release from jail. That gesture was something that the black community noticed and kept a note of. As a result, African Americans believed that JFK would help them gain equal rights. Now, Kennedy does do a lot of things to help African Americans. He promised to do a lot of things during his campaign, and eventually does put together a coalition that's going to lead to the passage of a major civil rights bill in 1964. But his legacy there is a mixed one. It speaks more to the fact that the Kennedys were not as progressive as a lot of people thought at the time. What else is different about the 1960s? What you have, as I was saying, is different tactics, different techniques. Do you ever think today and look at what's happening with Black Lives Matter and all that and say, wow, I don't know what could I do that would be different? What could I do that might be innovative to make a statement? It's a similar thing at this time. And so people said, what if we try to deal with issues such as transportation and desegregating the fact that once interstate buses crossed what was then known as the Mason-Dixon line, which separated the North from the South, you had to, black and white could no longer sit together. So they took these freedom rides, and this shows the map of where they went. Now, what you got here is basically a moving target of all people, all encapsulated into one area, moving into some of the most treacherous and most dangerous and bloodiest places in the South in terms of race. That took courage. That takes a lot of courage. Imagine being on one of those buses and pulling in to the stations of these places and seeing, people there basically with bats or with weapons or pretty much ready to, do violence to anybody involved. And in some cases they did firebomb buses. A very famous photograph right here of this Greyhound bus on fire. So you could see this is serious business. But how do you bring the civil rights movement to the Deep South states, especially Alabama and Mississippi, where white resistance was the strongest? These were ways of doing that. During the Freedom Rides, protesters were met with violent hostility from local whites. And this picture shows one of the buses, again, a closer photo of the bus firebombed. And notice people, strewn about. Guess who was also a freedom rider? John Lewis. Okay, John Lewis and James Zwerg. Again, I mentioned to you that SNCC was black and white. There were deep friendships that were formed, and you can see the violence. But check out, there's John Lewis right there, making history, a history maker, not afraid to get into good trouble, not afraid to start good trouble, if you will. This is the Ku Klux Klan that were terrorizing the Freedom Riders, and the Ku Klux Klan was issued a restraining order to prevent them from interfering with interstate buses during the spring and summer of 1961. During the Freedom Rides in December, a small group was arrested while protesting outside the segregated train station. Local leaders organized several marches and rallies for the rest of the month. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived and was arrested along with several other demonstrators. Now, this was the Albany campaign, and basically, the reason that we're mentioning this is the fact that it was not necessarily a successful campaign. Although hundreds were arrested and protests lasted for months, white city officials refused to negotiate and simply closed public facilities instead of integrating them. SNCC stayed away. In 1962, you have the Council of Federated Organizations that's formed by local Mississippi activists along with SNCC, NAACP, SCLC, and core members. They organized a freedom to vote, to register blacks to vote early in 1963. This was done to send a message to the state and federal governments that African Americans were going to vote and participate in the political system. So, when they tell us, everybody should vote, right? You should vote. People died so that you could vote. This is what they're talking about. These are the people. Because I always wonder that. Would we going as far back as slavery when we talk about people died so that you could vote? Oh, because that's true too. Or is it? It's more recent than that. It's as early as the 1960s, which, when you think about it, is not really that long ago. They also started a voter education program. In 1961, James Meredith applied to the University of Mississippi, an all-white college, in January of 1961. And a lot of times people don't realize this today, but you basically, you just couldn't apply if you were black, you could not apply to the University of Mississippi. And you would get a rejection letter as if you didn't have the grades or if you didn't, have the GPA, but actually the reason that you were being rejected was solely on the basis of the fact that they do not admit black people. And this is a letter demanding that his application be reconsidered or be considered at all for admission. So the struggle was real, as they say. There are things that people had to deal with then, and that were based on this notion about that states had the right to enforce these kinds of laws against the Constitution of the United States and against Brown versus Board of Education. Now, some of the white leadership during the time, was basically legally required to act. It didn't mean necessarily that they didn't have prejudice in their own hearts or that they had, completely changed, but they did try and attempt to follow the law and enforce the law. Governor Barnett was opposed to integration and tried to block Meredith's admission. So imagine just being a student applying to college and you're up against the governor of the state. With the help of the NAACP, Meredith obtained a court order to be admitted to the university. He was escorted by federal agents after rioting ensued on campus. So this is where, in my humble opinion, and let me know what you think, you have to give sometimes the United States, as bad as it can be, or as difficult as things can be in terms of the start that we had with race, you have to realize that we are a country of laws, and you can use those laws on your side in order to make change possible. I mean, imagine just being one person. You have to be escorted by federal agents and eventually, state, the National Guard and other places just to be able to go to class. Medgar Evers is another hero of mine, much like John Lewis. He was leader of the NAACP in Jackson, Mississippi. He was a dignified black man at a time when to be that was to be a threat to the system. and he was bold. Does anybody know anybody bold? Do you know any neighbors or do you know any friends or family who are just a little bit bolder in terms of how they do things? That's kind of how Medgar Evers was. He investigated, he had the gall and the nerve to investigate crimes against African Americans as a black man in Jackson, Mississippi, and led boycotts. And because of his boldness, he paid for it dearly with his life, and he was assassinated outside of his home after a meeting with other civil rights activists where they discussed ways to improve life for African Americans in Jackson. Basically, in his driveway, he was shot and killed. And one thing I want to leave today, too, if I can, I have made some videos and films, my own sort of some of the tribute films and stuff about some of these topics that I'd love to share with you as well. One of them took place at the 50th March on Washington, where I also had a chance, where John Lewis actually also spoke the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, which was in 2013. And I also have that on video, but I didn't think we had enough time for that today, so I'll leave the links. But Birmingham is another place that's mentioned a lot when you talk about civil rights. It's something that all people need to know about. Birmingham, Alabama was one of the most segregated cities in the South. The purpose of the many sit-ins and boycotts there from January through April 1963 was to end segregation. But what I want you to know is a lot of times when we've all seen this footage of people being sprayed with the water hoses from the 1960s. You might not think that that's such a big deal, or they look like they're just getting wet. I want you to know that the power of those hoses is enough to take the bark off of a tree. And it hits with a very powerful per square inch when it hits the body. And you can see how close by people are. And also, last time I checked, the fire department is no business spraying people. That's not where the tax dollars are for. If you live in Birmingham and you pay tax dollars to have your fire put out, never mind the waste of water. But see, that's how it was then, where a mayor could basically take the power and do things, how I want to say, like if they own the city. You know what I mean? Like if you own the city yourself and you say, yeah, we're going to do this, right? But the mayor never owns the city. The people are in charge of the city. But anyway, that was way beyond the point at this point. But this is very serious, pain. And they used police dogs on protesters. These same dogs that would be used, that were used in concentration camps, different things. This is terrible kind of treatment of a way of trying to do what? I didn't have enough time today to go back and talk about some of the prehistory, but this is really important as well. But what you see when you study American history, and that's basically like what I teach, is example after example demonstrating that this country was, at least in its initial idea, was formed as a country for white people only. Just a white republic, right? And I don't think there's anything bad to say. It's just a fact. When you start off with slavery, or you start off with all of this kind of, because what are these? They're constant efforts to remind black people that this has nothing to do with you. You're just here, right? But this is not your land. And what is that? Hopefully we'll have a chance to do a little question and answer at some point at the end here. But what is that if not what's happening today? Constant reminders, right? That whose nation this at least started off as a very bad idea, right? It wasn't a good start, okay? But that's entirely the point of all of what these people that we're looking at and seeing, what they did. they dreamed of a better world in a more democratic country and actually helped the United States live up to its own stated ideals, right? Like America said, all men are created equal. Like, we didn't say that, right? You said that. Like, that's your thing. It's like literally you said that in the Declaration of Independence. So black people, what they do, they and other minority groups, black and brown and others, push the country to actually do what? To realize its own stated goals. Like if you have a friend and they're like, I'm trying to lose weight this month, or I'm trying to go to the gym, and, you know, a month later, they never went to the gym, you would not be a good friend if you don't say anything, right? Like, I'm trying to help you live up to what you said you wanted to do. Right? Like, this wasn't my idea. You know, so black people actually do a major thing for America, which is actually help America realize its own stated beliefs. For that, I would think you would say, you know, thank you or something, you know, thank you. But they don't say thank you. They sick dogs on people. And believe me, that hurt too. Martin Luther King was arrested there in Birmingham, which they also called Bombingham was the nickname of it, because like I was saying, the beginning of your graphic novel that you're going to be reading soon, that first situation that was in Birmingham, right? That church that was bombed is in Birmingham, known as Bombingham. So every city and all these places, they do it differently. They do their hatred a little bit differently. Some are innovative. They use the fire hoses. Some come up with other things. When Martin Luther King was arrested there for defying a court order blocking the protests, this is where he wrote, and a lot of times I've mentioned this because people have read this, letter from a Birmingham jail. How many people, has anybody, man, I don't know how many people have read this, but has anybody read a letter from a Birmingham jail? Real quick, just show of hands. Okay, all the professors. But I see a few hands sprinkled out. Yeah, that's one that we read in high school. I remember that. But you know what that was about. In addition to being a major piece of prison literature, these local white ministers in Birmingham basically had written a letter to the editor saying, Martin Luther King, you're going too fast. The country's not ready. That you should slow down, right? And this is why it's important. People say, wow, why do we always have to push? Why do we always have to agitate, right? They thought King was going too fast, that he was too radical. And they're men of the cloth, as it would be called, that he had been a troublemaker. And he basically wrote back, he said, if not now, when? If not us, who? You know, for too long I've heard the word wait. You know, we've been told wait and be free. That wait, you know, we're going to get our freedom. Wait, we're going to have everything that we need. It's 2023, and people are still pointing out the fact that based on the 13th Amendment, I don't know if people know about this. If you saw a documentary called 13th, and I recommend everybody watch this documentary. Seriously, like if you don't do anything else, a couple head nods around. People know this one. Watch 13th. You may see a familiar face in there. Just saying. I was only in for a minute, but anyway, that's not the point. That's not the point right now. I was actually at a protest. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But it was hot out there, and if you see me sweating, that was why. But anyway, they said wait. In 1962, they're still saying wait. Eugene Bull Connor, he was the mayor, the police commissioner in Birmingham. He openly opposed integration. He was the one who authorized these, kinds of things. After the televised images of police brutality against protesters garnered northern white sympathy. That was important. See, there's politics here. The South is noticing, oh, wait a minute. The people in the North are supporting this, right? Or they seem to be. Although the North is no pretty picture at all either, but that's not the topic today. But a coroner ordered that violence only be practiced out of the spotlight. Meanwhile, in Alabama, you have Governor George Wallace, who eventually is going to run for president, believe it or not. And I think at this point, we believe anything. To confront the protesters, he opposed ending segregation. He used all of his powers to prevent it from happening. He's the guy who said segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And so Birmingham becomes the focus of the country. Here's some letters asking JFK to send troops there. And in May of 1963, after more than 1,200 people had been arrested, white leaders finally agreed to negotiate. Birmingham was to be desegregated, including lunch counters, restrooms, and water fountains. So they won. They won. And you'll find this over and over again, that these young people, John Lewis at the helm, and some of the most dynamic and brilliant people that you've ever seen who became part of this group called SNCC, SNCC, continue to win victories. This is just some photos. Now, of course, I've mentioned and referenced this already, the March on Washington, which they just actually celebrated another anniversary, just reenacted the 60th anniversary. This was because this is 2023. The 60th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. More than 250,000 people gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. John Lewis was there. He was one of them. Marches represented a broad spectrum of interests. I want everybody to know that this March on Washington had deep connections with the labor movement. The protesters wanted federal legislation to outlaw segregated facilities, but if you look at their signs, they're signs about what? About jobs. We demand voting rights, jobs for all now, and segregated rules in public schools. This is very interesting to me because my book, as was mentioned, is about desegregation of schools in Boston. And here's a great picture. And there's John Lewis right there with the famous A. Philip Randolph. He was working quite closely with him. The event was widely televised, which helped make it one of the most important demonstrations of the civil rights movement. And of course, it's at this march that is the bell about to ring? That King gives his famous speech. Oh, maybe somebody's unmuted. But I think I don't know if we have Zoom control, but maybe someone unmuted there. So we ask everybody could please mute. Thank you. But this is a momentous day and a momentous occasion. Now, just looking at time, I'll probably go for another few minutes, and then should I stop to take, do we do questions, or do we need time for that too much? A few minutes? Okay, no problem. Reverend King and President Lyndon Johnson meet to discuss the civil rights legislation that was going to be passed in the wake and as a tribute, in a way, to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy did eventually come to a courageous position around civil rights. It took him a while to get there. It took the Kennedys a while to get there. They were, after all, from Massachusetts and in Boston. But once Kennedy was assassinated, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. The bill was introduced into Congress in '63 prior to the March on Washington. JFK was trying to push it through until he was assassinated. LBJ was able to use his influence in Congress to help get it passed. Civil Rights Act of '64 does a lot. It basically legally ends segregation. It outlawed discrimination in any federally funded program or job. It made racial discrimination and segregation in public places such as theaters, restaurants, and hotels illegal. And so it's a major victory. When we talk about us today being an integrated society, a lot of it really, the roots of it lie in that 64 Civil Rights Act. And so the students really seized the moment. SNCC, John Lewis among them, and head down to Mississippi in the summer of 1964. Many Northern white students volunteered. Those white students who are basically about to be pushed out by 1966. And I kid you not, there's a lot of, when you say SNCC, there's a lot of ex-SNCC members out there who are black and white who feel a lot about that split to this very day, especially the white members. Volunteers registered voters and eventually encouraged them to vote for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party is a major step forward in terms of black political mobilization and action. Today, people raise the issue, well, with the choices that we have as candidates, wouldn't it be nice to have a black party? Why can't we have a black political party to this day? And people say, oh, it would never work. But they did it already. It already happened. It could work. Volunteers also set up freedom schools to raise awareness of the inequities of the education system, where African-American schools had limited resources. I don't know if people know what's going on today in the state of Florida, for example, but the governor, UO's governor, he's lost his mind down there. And he has passed some laws that have actually outlawed what we're doing right at this very moment, which is teaching and talking about black history. If we were in Florida right now, we actually would have to vacate the room and leave. Some people probably be like, okay, I'll be all right with that. No, don't believe the hype, right? And what are they doing now? They're setting up freedom schools in Florida, and in other states, in Alabama and other places as well. We're having to go back to the playbook of the civil rights movement. But when the powers that be are also going back to the playbook of oppression and segregation, which I think you could argue might be happening right now, then it makes sense that you may have to go back to that playbook. So this is why the training and teaching and what you all are learning in this session, in this program, is actually probably a lot of information to take in, but very, very important to our survival and to the strategizing of the movement. On June 21st, 1964, the three men who set out to investigate a church bombing, another church bombing, notice, after being arrested for traffic violations, the men were held for several hours in jail and basically went missing. Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. Andrew Goodman, Michael Cheney, and this was just a terrible, James Cheney and Michael Schwerner, just a terrible incident that took place, but it caught people's attention because these were both black and white caught together, having been assaulted and attacked together. I mean, even some of the hard truths that we have to face is for the fact that, like, even today, you see, like, and I don't want to say anything that's out of order or anything like that, but you see, like, when, if a black woman goes missing, which many black women have been going missing, actually, I don't know if everybody connects with this, but in D.C. and other places, honestly, people don't seem to really get that worried about this. White woman goes missing, and this is no disrespect or to anybody or either group, to white people or black people, but why is it that when that happens, I mean, they'll be out there with the dogs and, all-night manhunt, 24-hour manhunt, looking around and stuff like that. Why does so many situations in American life and culture change when we swap the race? You notice that? We pull over, you've seen countless black men and women being pulled over in their vehicles, right? And we've seen how that goes. Have you seen the videos where they pull white people over sometimes? I saw one video, the guy's like, don't do it. He's like, puts his hand on the wheel. Don't do it. Puts his hand on the shifter. No, come on. He's got the gun at him. And the guy just drove away. I mean, am I crazy? Am I the only one seeing these videos? The guy just literally drove away, right? Because that's what we have to learn. That's what you all are learning now. What constitutes those differences in American life and culture? He tells you everything you need to know. But anyway, these folks that we're talking about were fighting for basic rights. They had to formulate freedom schools in order to just keep being able to learn and being able to teach this history. Here are some photos from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the 1964 Democratic Convention. This became a big deal, and I want to direct also your attention to this photograph right here. The sign of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was a Black Panther. And that is actually where the idea, that's where they're going to take the symbol of the Black Panthers, out in Oakland a couple of years later, moving into Black Power. But that was their slogan, move on over or we'll move on over you. And at the same time, you have people like Malcolm X, who all along these years is out there preaching, speaking, and giving a strong, more militant perspective. Malcolm X began his activist career by preaching black separatism. He felt that blacks should not try to fit into white society. Instead, they should focus on developing their own communities and economic structures. He also believed in using violence to achieve these goals if necessary. And he actually had a house here in Queens somewhere around, I'm not exactly sure how close it is from here, but in 1964, Malcolm X made a pilgrimage to Mecca as dictated by his Muslim beliefs. On this trip, he came to believe in the brotherhood of all races and changed his stance on separatism between blacks and whites. He broke away from the Nation of Islam and worked with people of all races. So here's another interesting story of a person who basically started off feeling and thinking one way, and towards the end of his life changed to believe in a more open way, and finally connected with Martin Luther King. What kind of world would we be living in today had Malcolm X and Martin Luther King lived and been allowed to live, and instead of slain and taken down? Malcolm X, at this point in his career, he changed his belief, but he stayed militant, and he was pushing towards taking America to the court of the United Nations, to the International Court of Law there, to be sued for human rights abuses in terms of segregation and racism. That scared a lot of people. That definitely got people's attention. But I know I need to wrap it up here, but Malcolm X was assassinated while giving a speech on February 21st, 1965. The 3 gunmen arrested and convicted were believed to be Nation of Islam members. Now, I mentioned Malcolm because that's another New York connection. Malcolm was actually from, a few different places. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska. His family moved around quite a bit, Lansing, Michigan, and Wisconsin for a while. They stayed in Lansing, which was close to Detroit, and they started calling him Detroit Red, although he never really lived in Detroit. And he ended up in Boston for a long time as well, during some key years of his life, and was, by the time of assassination, lived here in New York. Lastly, a march was organized by the SCLC from Selma to Montgomery. Now, this is the quintessential. I want to just bring it home with this John Lewis story. John Lewis was a key part of this march. How many people saw the movie Selma? Okay, a few hands. We have mentioned like all the movies from the same director. We could do this whole thing by watching like 3 movies. 13th, and then When They See Us. I don't know if anyone saw that one. And Selma. But demonstrators were met by police with tear gas and clubs and violence. They were attacked. John Lewis is somewhere in here. The event became known as Bloody Sunday. A second march, another attempt, was organized on March 10th, 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. motivated the marchers to register to vote. And because of their efforts, because of John Lewis and others marching, being trampled upon by police and on horseback, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in August. And so that's pretty much all the important events of the 1960s that you need to know. I know this PowerPoint will be on file, and you have it on video and are able to watch it. And so I'm going to stop it right there, because after 1965, we're really moving into a new period of Black power, and we don't have quite enough time to talk about that. Thank you very much.